Hello and welcome to yet another study of the book of Zechariah. In this particular lesson, we're going to be in chapters 9 and 10, and I've entitled this one, God's Coming Judgment and the King of Peace. Obviously, we're going to be looking towards the coming of the Messiah. Here is the rough outline that we're using, and this is where we are in this particular lesson. Homer Haley, in his commentary, just to introduce this new section, because we're going into a new section of Zechariah, he had this to say. The third division of Zechariah, that's chapters 9 to 14, consists of two burdens, chapters 9 to 11 and 12 to 14. Each is introduced by the title, The Burden of the Word of Jehovah. The first is pronounced upon the heathen, and the second concerns Israel. In the first part of this third division, chapters 9 to 11, the prophet deals with the fall of the heathen nations and the coming of the king who would rule in peace. But when he would come, he would be rejected as a shepherd, despised and cast away, to be sold for the paltry price of a wounded slave. Many think that quite a number of years have passed between where we ended in our last lesson in chapter 8 and where we're beginning in chapter 9. They believe that Zechariah was now an old man. We do not have a date stamp as we start off. The temple would have been completed, but times were still hard for the Jewish people. The people needed another word of encouragement, which Yahweh sent to them through Zechariah. Both of these sections, chapters 9 to 11 and 12 to 14, contain prophecies of the Messiah, and many of these are quoted in the apostles' writings in the New Testament. Haley went on to say about these chapters, in view of the admitted difficulty of these chapters, and in light of Peter's claim that no prophecy of Scripture is of private interpretation, it seems wise to build one's interpretation of these chapters around the passages that are quoted by Jesus and the New Testament writers. In following this policy, one will avoid the pitfalls of speculation and some of the quagmires of error into which many have fallen. So, let's begin. Chapter 9, verse 1. The section opens with, the Net Bible terms it an oracle. The literal Hebrew word would be translated burden, as Homer Haley referred to in his commentary. The problem with either of these two words is that neither really totally conveys what the Hebrew word means. Oracle is the one used by the majority of modern translations. Baldwin, in the Tyndale Old Testament commentary, said this: to avoid the rather neutral term oracle, therefore, must be added the idea of compulsion, urgency, dread. The prophet would escape, if he could, from what may understandably be called his burden. So that may help explain what that word burden means. But this is Yahweh's message concerning, as we open up here, specifically the land of Hadrach, with its focus on Damascus. Now you may be like me wondering, where is Hadrach? Well, Net Bible Study Notes tells us that the land of Hadrach was a northern region stretching from Aleppo in the north to Damascus in the south. And it also notes that the New Living Translation has Aram there instead of Hadrach. So we're talking about roughly this area here. Modern archaeologists identify Hadrach with Hatarica of Assyrian inscriptions, which places this area north of Lebanon. That's not 100% conclusive. The attention of everyone, though, in the text was focused on Yahweh, as are the eyes of Hamath, near Damascus down there, as well as Tyre, and Sidon over there on the coast. So it's this area here that this is initially addressed to. And they are watching to see what Yahweh would do. All of these, though, considered themselves very wise, and perhaps there's the idea that they were too smart to get caught up in such judgment. They might be wise in the ways of the world, but in spite of this wisdom, they too would come under Yahweh's judgment. Collins, in the New Bible Commentary, wrote, "The agencies of the punishment inflicted upon Syria were the armies of Alexander the Great." This is what was coming. Another translation possibility, by the way, is rather than they are watching to see what Yahweh would do, is that the Lord's eye is on everyone, including Israel. It mentions here that Tyre had built a fortification for herself and piled up silver like dust and gold like the mud of the streets. In other words, wealth was everywhere. Historically, Tyre had built a stronghold on an island about a half-mile offshore and had established themselves as a great commercial power of trade by sea. God, though, would evict her, shove her fortifications into the sea, and Tyre would be consumed by fire. Ezekiel talked about this, did he not? In chapter 27. And we know from history that Nebuchadnezzar had attempted to destroy Tyre but failed, that it would be Alexander the Great who completed the fulfillment of both Ezekiel and Zechariah's prophecies. And when Tyre refused to surrender to Alexander and his armies, he built a 200-foot wide causeway from the mainland out to the island with the rubble of the former city on the mainland, and then he attacked the island city, and it never recovered, and became a place for fishermen to dry their nets, as Ezekiel prophesied in chapter 26, verse 5. The main point here, though, is that Syria would be conquered, and Yahweh was behind it. The locations then move south. The 4 cities of the Philistines would see what happened and recognized what God could do. Ashkelon would see this, and they would be afraid. Gaza would be in great anguish. Ekron would be also, and her hope would dry up. By the way, she was the northernmost of these cities of the Philistines. Gaza would lose her king. Ashkelon would no longer be inhabited. A mixed people lived in Ashdod. God would greatly humiliate the Philistines. He would take away their abominable religious practices. That Bible study notes points out the Hebrew literally is, and I will take away their blood from their mouth and their abominations from between their teeth. They explain it this way. These expressions refer to some type of abominable religious practices, perhaps eating meat with the blood still in it, less likely what the New Century Version has in drinking blood, or eating unclean or forbidden foods. So that seems to be what is going on here. Collins comments, this signifies a change in religious observance on the part of the nations. The Philistines did not observe the restrictions placed upon the Jews with respect to eating blood, so that the statements in this verse taken together indicate a change of spiritual loyalty on their part. Those who survived would become believers in the true God, like one of the clans of Judah. Colin points out that we have Josephus' writings, which record that the Philistines became part of the Jewish nation. Ekron would be like the Jebusites. The Jebusites were the original inhabitants of Jerusalem, and they were assimilated into Israel under David's rule. Baldwin wrote that Ekron shall be like the Jebusites refers to the fact that when David took Jerusalem, he did not wipe out the Jebusite inhabitants, but allowed them to be absorbed into Judah. And by the time of the 1st century AD, Philistia had lost its identity as a separate nation and the people as a separate people. Haley wrote that a historical fulfillment of the prophecy is unknown, although Alexander of Macedonia conquered these cities. There was no general turning by them to God or to the Jews. The fulfillment of the prediction may be looked for under the Messiah, when the gospel was preached to all and all stood on a common level before Jehovah. And I think Haley's right there. We don't have the people of Philistia becoming Jews, but we do have a lot of the people of that area becoming Christians later on under the Messiah. So that would make sense there. God would then surround his house and protect it like a guard from anyone going back and forth. God's house here, by the way, is not a reference to the temple, although some translations like the Net Bible translate it this way. It's a reference to God's people, to his family. No one would cross over against them anymore as an oppressor. Notice how this section started way up there in the north in Syria, and then came south to the land of the Philistines, and finally ended up at Jerusalem. George Adam Smith, in the Book of the 12 Prophets, wrote this: it figures the progress of war from the north of Syria southwards by the valley of the Orontes to Damascus, and then along the coasts of Phoenicia and the Philistines. All these shall be devastated, but Jehovah will camp about his own house, and it shall be inviolate. Baldwin wrote that the first section of this second part of the book establishes from the start two important facts. Number one, the Lord's victory is certain. And number two, he intends to bring back to himself peoples long alienated from him. These truths underlie all that follows and culminate in the universal worship of the King, the Lord of hosts, in chapter 14, verses 16 through 19. So this is the beginning of this whole section here, and it's foreshadowing what we're going to see at the very end in 2 more lessons' time. God's people, daughter of Zion, daughter of Jerusalem, could rejoice. By the way, this section, verses 9 and 10, are set off in the Net Bible as poetry, and this seems to be Hebrew poetry. But they could rejoice, and the reason they could rejoice was very simple. Their king was coming. Haley wrote that this can only look to the Messiah's coming. There is no individual whom the higher critics have been able even plausibly to substitute. There are some commentators, particularly in the latter half of the 1800s, who want to make all this apply somewhere else. But no, this is foreshadowing the coming of the Messiah. Baldwin adds that most commentators agree that it is the Messiah who is foreshadowed here. He, the text tells us, would be legitimate or righteous or just. He would be victorious. He would bring salvation. And we're more familiar with this phrase, he would be humble and riding on a donkey, a young donkey, the foal of a female donkey. And the idea there is he'd be riding on an unbroken colt of a donkey. Net Bible study notes tell us that the Hebrew term tzaddik, ordinarily translated righteous, frequently occurs, as here, with the idea of conforming to a standard or meeting certain criteria. The Messianic king riding into Jerusalem is fully qualified to take the Davidic throne. The New Testament understands this verse to be a prophecy of the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and properly so. Absolutely. Haley points out that since the days of Solomon, royal persons had ridden upon horses, but the character of the Messiah's kingship would be completely different. The difference in character would be demonstrated by his humble entrance upon his rule. He came in riding on a donkey, which is what King David rode. Collins, again, he is mounted not on a prancing war horse, but on the animal favored by the man of peace. Here we have an exact forecast of Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Text goes on. God would remove the chariot from Ephraim, that represents the northern kingdom, and the war horse from Jerusalem, and that represents the southern kingdom of Judah. Both of these areas would be united under the Messiah. The battle bow would be removed. And the point is that the Messiah's kingdom would not be one of warfare and force to expand or even to defend the kingdom. Peace would be announced to the nations. Haley comments that his message would be one of peace unto the nations, the heathen people, who would be included with Ephraim and Judah. This was the message of Christ through the gospel to both Jews and Gentiles, and Paul points that out in Ephesians chapter 2. The rule of the coming king would be from sea to sea, from the Euphrates to the ends of the earth. Hebrew, by the way, literally there is from the river to the ends of the earth, but the river is understood to be a reference to the river Euphrates. In other words, what this is saying is the Messiah's rule would be worldwide. Again, quoting Homer Haley, all four gospel writers include Jesus' entry into Jerusalem in the manner foretold by Zechariah, although only Matthew and John refer specifically to the words of the prophet. This entry of Jesus into Jerusalem among the hosannas of the multitude marked the beginning of his passion, which culminated in his being crowned king over God's kingdom, to reign at his right hand till the end of time. Because of their covenant relationship with God, secured with blood, he would release their prisoners from the waterless pit, the text next tells us. The blood of my covenant with you, Baldwin comments. The covenant was ratified by blood sacrifice at its initiation under Abraham, at its extension under Moses, and in its continual renewal through the daily offerings in the temple. The association of the two words has become familiar through Jesus' use of them at the institution of the Lord's Supper in Mark 14. And in his death, they took on their full meaning. The blood referred to here would be the blood that dedicated the covenant God made with Israel at Mount Sinai. And because of this covenant, God would set free the prisoners that were from Ephraim as well as Judah. Homer Haley writes, the prisoners were those yet in foreign countries, apart from God, and in bondage to foreigners and to their sins. The pit signifies their imprisonment, as one put in an empty cistern, as were Joseph and Jeremiah. These pits or cisterns were bottle-shaped with small openings from which one could not free himself, but could be released only with the help of another. And Baldwin adds to that, to be delivered from a pit in which there was no drinking water was life from death. Think about that. That's exactly what that would be. They needed to return to the stronghold with hope. This is where there was safety and protection. If they were to do that, God would return double what had been taken from them. Almost recalls to mind what happened to Job at the end of that particular book of wisdom. Haley writes that the double indicates a balancing of the scales. Their sins have received commensurate punishment, and the punishment would receive commensurate blessings. And then he would bend Judah as his bow and Ephraim as his arrow. Again, quoting from Haley, it seems clear that Jehovah here speaks of the Grecian invasion under Alexander and the conditions that followed in the days of the Maccabees and even in the time of the Messiah. Alexander was a devoted apostle of Greek culture and philosophy, and his zeal left an indelible impression on all the countries of his invasion and an impression of special significance on the Jews. Many younger Jews left the Orthodox faith for Hellenism or for a compromise with it. Baldwin talks about the weapons there. These weapons are not, however, to be interpreted in terms of war, any more than similar imagery applied to the servant, suffering servant of Isaiah, implying literal fighting. We are to picture the Lord so in command of the affairs of Israel and Judah that he could handle them as effectively as an experienced soldier does his weapons. And he's going to stir up the sons of Zion against the sons of Greece. Haley writes, this religious, cultural, and social difference broke out in violent conflict under the Seleucids of Syria and the Maccabees of Judea. It was a conflict of ideologies and religion. And that took place in what we often refer to as the intertestamental period. Yahweh would then appear above them, and his arrow would shoot like lightning. The sovereign Yahweh would blow the trumpet and proceed in the southern storm winds. Yahweh of heaven's armies would prevail, or would guard, and they would prevail and overcome with sling stones. They would then drink and become noisy like drunkards. They would be full like the sacrificial basin, or like the corners of the altar. Again, Haley comments that as the bowls of the altar were filled with the blood of the sacrificed animal to be splashed or sprinkled against the sides of the altar, so they would be filled with the blood of victory. It indicates a hard-fought but victorious war between the forces of Jehovah and those of the world. And it's on that day that Yahweh, their God, would deliver them as the flock of his people. And they are referred to here as precious stones of a crown sparkling over his land. How precious and fair they were. Grain would make the young men flourish. New wine would make the young women flourish, indicating a time following this of plenty, with loads of grain, loads of the grapevine. Haley says that the picture is one of prosperity, plenty, and increase. Whether this was ever fulfilled materially is unknown, but it was gloriously fulfilled spiritually in the victorious kingdom of the Lord. That leads us into chapter 10. Haley opens this by saying there seems to be no new promises in chapter 10, but it appears that the chapter is an enlarging or expounding of those in chapter 9. The prophet continues the concluding promise of prosperity and plenty, but an exhortation to the people of God to ask Jehovah for the blessings needed and to pray to him. So he begins by saying they needed to pray to Yahweh for the rains that they needed, the late spring rains. These were the rains before harvest. These were essential for the development of the grain. See, it's Yahweh who is the one who would bring the rain. He calls thunderstorms. He would give showers of rain and green growth in the field. But what were they doing? They were consulting the household gods. The Hebrew word literally there is the teraphim. These that they're consulting were speaking wickedness. Think about it. These images could neither make promises nor provide what the people needed. There's no way an image could provide the rain that was needed. And as far as the soothsayers were equally useless. They were speaking lies. And the dreamers, they had nothing to offer either. Their comfort was useless because it wasn't from God, but from themselves. So don't go into other areas seeking help. Go directly to the source. Go to God himself. Haley writes, because they had hearkened to those other things, Israel had gone into captivity, been afflicted, and were as sheep without a shepherd, for their king had been cast out. When they rejected Jehovah for falsehood and lies, they were left with neither a king to whom they could look, nor with an almighty God on whom they could lean. Because they rejected God, they lost their king and they lost God. Baldwin writes, because the leaders looked in the wrong direction for their advice, they failed to give an effective lead and the people drifted aimlessly. A modern parallel is the renewed interest in magic, spiritism, and other survivals of primitive times. The more widespread modern equivalent is to ignore God altogether and tacitly to assume that no problem is beyond man's unaided power to solve, as if we can solve all the problems that we face. The people, though, were like sheep. They had become scattered because they had no shepherd. That's very, very similar to what Ezekiel wrote in chapter 34 of his prophecy. God was enraged at the shepherds. He was going to punish the lead goats. These would be the leading men of the nation. Yahweh of heaven's armies had brought blessing to his flock, the house of Judah. Baldwin explains, basically it expresses the conviction that he closely observed them and cares for them to the extent of intervening in history on their behalf. God is the one who can take care of them, not anybody or anything else. And he would transform them into his majestic war horse. From Judah would come the cornerstone, the wall peg, the battle bow, and every ruler. And from him is referring to from Judah here. The cornerstone was the stone that was placed at an angle where two walls met. It made sure the walls were straight, they were true, and it added strength. Of course, the Messiah is spoken of as the chief cornerstone. Wall peg. Now that one may be a little bit more obscure to us. Net Bible Study Notes tells us that the peg refers to a wall hook, although frequently translated tent peg, but American Standard Version there actually has nail, but it's a wall hook from which tools and weapons were suspended, but figuratively also to the promise of God upon which all of Israel's hopes were hung. So it sort of fits the image there, does it not? The battle bow and every ruler, that's simply talking about everything necessary to withstand the attacks of an enemy. That is what could be supplied by God for his people through the nation of Judah. Everything they needed to withstand an attack. All these things God would provide for them. Baldwin commented that the last line plainly states that out of them every ruler, Judah will be the tribe to supply future leadership. The Targum interprets this verse as referring to the Messiah. Targum are Jewish writings, and they interpreted this as being messianic, and I believe that it is. They would be like warriors trampling the mud of the streets in battle. They would fight and defeat the enemy cavalry because the Lord would be with them. Baldwin writes that the simile is intended to describe triumphant conquest in the face of overwhelming odds, footmen against cavalry. The fact that they have fought at all and not fled in retreat admits of only one explanation. The Lord is with them. God would strengthen the kingdom of Judah, and he would deliver the people of Joseph. Judah and Joseph, Baldwin explains, stands for the southern and northern kingdoms as a whole. All who were still living far from the land would be made mighty and be delivered and be brought back home. I will answer them implies prayer for deliverance, which has been heard and is about to be answered, because the period of discipline is over. He would bring them back because of his compassion for them. They would be as if he had never rejected them. That's talking about totally being restored to a relationship with God. He was Yahweh their God, and therefore he would hear them. The Ephraimites would be like warriors. Haley sort of ties all this together by saying, although from Judah would be the cornerstone, the peg, the battle bow, and every ruler, Jehovah gives Ephraim further assurance that they of the northern tribes would not be neglected. They too would be like a mighty man, thoroughly capable of casting off and defeating their enemies. They would rejoice as if they had drunk wine. Their children would see their rejoicing and also rejoice. And they would celebrate the things of the Lord. Haley points out that the question arises as to whether these promises are limited to the Maccabean struggle or whether they have a more far-reaching implication. True, Jehovah gave some victories to the people through the Maccabean leadership, but to limit the prophecies to that particular period is to do violence to the general nature of prophecy. However, for the ultimate and complete fulfillment of the prophecy, one must look to the Messianic age, when Judah and Ephraim were joined together in a spiritual union, fighting a spiritual warfare. God would signal for them, and he would gather them to him. The Hebrew, by the way, literally there is, I will whistle for them. And you've heard people whistling for dogs. That's the idea, that God would whistle and they would come. Baldwin says that this is the shepherd who knows just where his sheep are because he scattered them, calling them back with his own characteristic call. He had already redeemed them. He'd bought them back, and they would become as numerous as they previously had been. Though he had scattered them among the nations, they would remember in places that were far away, and they would return with their children. This idea of scattering here is a scattering of seed by hand. That he has sort of scattered them into the other nations. He had planted them. He had sown them in those nations. And they're going to be called back by him. Haley says Jehovah's sowing Ephraim does not here indicate a further scattering of them, but a sowing and planting of them to himself, as indicated by Hosea. Thus sown to Jehovah among the nations, the people would increase, remember Jehovah, and with their children return to him and worship him, thus becoming a witness for the Lord. Specifically, it mentions that God would bring them back from Egypt and gather them from Assyria. So we have here a picture of the Exodus, but rather than just being from Egypt, the people are going to be brought back from all over the world. Some suggest this is also looking ahead to the Gentiles, or it at least includes the Gentiles. Haley writes that not only would those brought back with Judah from the captivity be Jehovah's, but from among distant nations he would call those both of the scattered 10 tribes and of the Gentiles to himself. Paul's use of Hosea to include the Gentiles may further indicate this, and he does that in Romans chapter 9. He would bring them back to the lands of Gilead and Lebanon. That's the northern area of Israel. Again, Haley comments that, but as Egypt and Assyria symbolize the bondage and captivity of the people, so Gilead and Lebanon seem to symbolize the restoration to their proper habitation. And there would be so many of them, the text tells us, that there wouldn't be room for them all. God would cross the sea of storms and calm the turbulence. The idea is that he would be there with his people. The depths of the Nile would dry up. The Nile was the source of life of Egypt. The pride of Assyria would be humbled. What's saying here is that the domination of Egypt would be no more. Egypt's no longer going to be a threat. The Hebrew literature there is rather than domination of Egypt, it's the scepter of Egypt, but the rulership of Egypt. God would strengthen his people by his power. Hebrew literally there says, I will strengthen them in Yahweh, and they would walk about in his name. This expression, Net Bible's or Collins in the New Bible Commentary tells us, the expression they shall walk up and down in his name signifies that the conduct of the restored people would be in accordance with the will of God. So chapter 10 ends on a very positive note for God's people. So what can we see? What lessons can we see in these two chapters that would help us in our lives as Christians today? I came up with 6. First one is this: God is in control of history and is in control of history before it happens. He always is. But we also see that the Lord will always care for his people, and we need to trust in him. The Messiah's kingdom, we see in these chapters, is one of peace. That should tell us what we should be as his people. We have a covenant relationship that's been secured with the blood of the Messiah. The text talked about a covenant relationship secured with blood, and that seems to be a reference to the old law, the old covenant, but we have an even better covenant relationship that the Hebrew writer talks about, and it's secured with the blood of the Messiah. We also need to be asking God for the blessings that we need. Remember that it said to pray for the rains? We need to be asking God. Haley commented that even though God promises man his daily bread, prayer to the Lord of all blessings is an acknowledgement on man's part of his dependence on a higher power for all he receives. We don't really produce anything. We can't even make a seed that grows. God does that. And the final lesson: when we reject God's word, we are left without trustworthy guidance of any type. When they had rejected God's leadership, they had no trustworthy guidance. When we reject God's word, we are left with the same thing. Thank you for taking time to listen to this particular lesson, and I hope it's been of help. And we hope that you'll come back and join us for our next lesson as we finish up this first oracle and get into the second oracle.